Who are some of these big players who are there or the big components of the sector?
Space is a vast area.
How far or like ahead or behind are we in terms of what's happening? Like, where are we in terms of competing with the global players?
Space tech is something that is not accessible to 90-95% of the countries out there. Building satellites, building rockets is comparatively still a high risk activity as compared to, let's say, building cables and nuts and bolts. Often, a war type scenario forces societies to, work on this with all organizations, companies working towards this. But in peacetime scenarios, the incentivization is not that high for private companies to do this kind of high risk work. Funding aayega jayega jo bhi hoga, that is separated. That's a separate part of the company. We keep building, focusing on developing IP and focusing on developing the core that brings value to the company, which is the technology itself. That is our moat.
What's your boldest prediction around this, given all that we need to do? What do you think might happen by 2030? What will we see in the Indian space tech ecosystem? Hello, everyone. Welcome to Manufacturing Mindset. I'm glad to have on the show today Soumya Mishra, who's a co-founder and CEO of Sisir Radar. Soumya, welcome to the show.
Hi Sarvesh, thank you for having me on your show.
No, great to chat with you today. Super. So without letting go any time, Soumya, who are meeting you today for the first time, tell us what does Sisir Radar do and more about you.
Sure. So, Sisir Radar is a deep tech startup that focuses on space technology with the technology of choice that we developed something called synthetic aperture radar. Synthetic aperture radar is one of the foremost Earth observation or intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance technology, which allows you to see in the dark and see through clouds right from satellites. And the particular bands of synthetic aperture radar that we are working in can not only see through dark and see through clouds, but also can see through foliage and through the ground right from space. And within this segment, what we have achieved is a 10x better resolution than the current global standard. And I think a lot of credit for this goes to the great founding team that we have, and the primary credit I would like to give to the one of the main founders, Dr. Tapan Mishra, former director of ISRO and a globally renowned expert in synthetic aperture radar. A little bit about me. So I have done bachelor's and master's in electrical engineering from IIT Kanpur. Master's was focused on quantum physics. Started off my career in the semiconductor industry in Intel. Moved on to heading hardware design and manufacturing in a consumer electronics startup, which later got acquired by Hike. And post pandemic, myself, my wife Urmi, and my father Tapan sir, we started this company to take the space tech forward and leverage the new space policy that was promulgated, I think, roughly around 2021 2022.
Super. Thanks for sharing that. Just for the ease of simplicity, also for the user to understand, would it be like a technology that is used in existing satellites? Is that one how should think about the radar systems that you're providing?
Yes, so this technology or this kind of technology is already used in satellites, not just in India but across the world. But in any domain of technology, you keep improving your quality, right? Like, think of the cameras on your phones like 15 years ago. Very horrible image. Today you get like 4K, 8K, God knows how deep resolution you get in your phones, right? So your technology improves. Same with your satellite imaging technology as well, and that is where we see our opportunity to build better and better sensors that give crisper and more information dense imagery of the earth.
Super. And before we go deeper into the technology itself, and we'll spend a lot of time on the sector also, just as a founder, give some sense of what flipped the journey for you from, working in Intel and some of the other startups to actually, starting your own company in this space.
Sure. I think personally for me, I always had a little bit of clarity that, in the long term with my life and with my career, I would like to do something of my own. And the reason being to do something which I personally find meaningful given my journey, right? And I think I would have shaped my career in hindsight to align to that, because I have grown up in a family of scientists. Both my parents have been senior scientists in ISRO for 40 years. So I have been privileged to grow up in the space community, seeing rockets and satellites right from when I was a kid. So since a very small age, I think I've had it in my mind that it's my destiny to do something in space. And it just so happened that I've been lucky that, even the policies and the global, direction of the economy has shifted, where today in the 2020s, it is feasible and possible for startup companies in India to do something in space. Now, within the, like, running a startup is hard, right? Entrepreneurship in general is hard, but doing it in hardware, which is comparatively capex heavy, and that too in hardware which is fairly complex, which is space tech, it requires a little bit of prior grounding. So I think a lot of my career experiences have been chosen to give me the kind of background and experience on which I can build. So from, I think, from the Intel days, the biggest thing that I pick up is, like, chipsets that they make are like extremely complex, but the company and the organization is extremely process driven, and that is why they can, bring out new innovations in a predictable fashion. And that process driven mindset is something I picked up from Intel. From my Creo days, the startup in where I was heading the hardware and manufacturing, well, I got to experience firsthand what it is like for a bunch of 20-year-olds to try to, build a company, and not just build a company, to build a company in hardware systems. So I think those experiences have been invaluable for me, and I would give them like full credit for, being the stepping stones for allowing me to be where I am today.
Interesting. And of course, like you mentioned, space tech is, of course, a space that is seeing a lot of interest in general, including policy push by the government, and a lot of entrepreneurs like you who are building in this space. For an average listener, why should they care about this space? And, just talk about the significance actually that space tech has, which in a normal life, probably we don't, appreciate it as much.
Okay, so while we focus on a particular segment of space tech, which is, imaging using satellites, but let me talk about space tech in general. Think about, back to the 90s, right? There are a bunch of cyclones which hit Odisha and West Bengal every year. I remember in 1999 or 98, I don't remember which year exactly, but there was a massive super cyclone which had hit Odisha, and I had, for my summer vacation with my family, gone to Odisha to visit some relatives, right? I had seen the devastation over there. Tens of thousands of people had died, trees uprooted, infrastructure damage, animals, people, dead bodies lying everywhere. Cyclones of that severity hit today also. Probably they have become more severe because of climate change. Yet, when is the last time that you have heard that, because of a cyclone, leave aside 10,000, even 10 people have died, right? The reason, we have been able to mitigate the impact of cyclones hitting the land is because with ISRO's technology, we have been able to predict cyclone landfall with such precision that even if the intensity of cyclones and tornadoes have increased, but we can, evacuate the right area at the right time and basically save a lot of lives. So that is one impact of space technology that affects everyone, and I think it's a privilege for me to be able to explain, how space has been able to help in saving people's lives. So this is just one aspect where I think it would connect. Similarly, you look at, like, broadcast of high definition television, telecommunication today and in the future, with all the stuff that, SpaceX is doing with Starlink, your GPS navigation. Like, today no one remembers the routes inside the cities, right? Because you have a map which tells you precisely which lane of the road you are in. That is also because of satellites. The imagery that you get, that comes from imaging satellites. Modern warfare depends on satellite imagery and intelligence acquired from satellites, right from agriculture to animal husbandry to disaster management to, obviously, like, military, maritime, mining, whatever industry you have, you satellites and space technology does has an impact on that.
Got it. So pretty much everything fundamental that's happening, it's like that invisible hand that is making everything happen, which we don't see, but is, fundamental to, everything that we're doing right now. And, which has a profound significance, and which is why perhaps there is as much focus right now. Tell us where we are in the ecosystem in terms of India right now. How much of what we are using in terms of the GPS, weather communications, all these technologies that we are building is something, some of those technologies being made in India. versus we being dependent on other countries right now?
So I think so far, and because of the history of the industry, the heavy lifting of space tech in India, as we know today in 2025, is being done by ISRO, right? Because ISRO also has a legacy of multiple decades. Uh, Through ISRO satellites, we do have our own GPS satellites or Navik satellites. We do have our high resolution Earth observation satellites, telecom, broadcast, weather prediction satellites, so on and so forth. Now, within India, post the new space policy which came around in the earlier part of this decade, after that policy got passed, it became possible for private companies to do something meaningful in this segment. When I say meaningful, that is build satellites or build rockets. Prior to the new space policy, space companies could only work as vendors of ISRO. And I think one of the philosophical reasons for opening up the space sector to the private industry is for allowing the private industry to do what it does best, right? ISRO is great, or government organizations are really great at doing cutting edge research and development, and building and innovating technologies that do not exist yet. But just having a great technology is not enough. It needs to be taken and scaled, right? So for example, if we take satellite, and just if we take imaging for satellites, one RISat, which is a SAR satellite of India, can give very very good high resolution imagery. But let's say if you need like imaging across India on a daily basis, one satellite doesn't cut it. Depending on the orbit choice and the satellite choice, you're looking at somewhere between 50 to 150 satellites, right? Now, scaling up from a few to a many satellites, that is the role of the private industry, and that is where I think a lot of the space tech companies, particularly led by very high risk appetite startups, they are, I think, leading the case. And there are a bunch of companies that are working on different kinds of satellites, launchers or rockets, and ground station operations and stuff like that. And we are in the early days of this industry. I'm sure, like by 2030, this industry would have become a little more mature, and you will start hearing in the mainstream about private launches and private satellites being done by private companies in India.
So how vulnerable are we today? Like, for example, we have only a few of the many that we need. What happens if some other country that we're depending upon actually jams their satellites or doesn't provide our access? What happens in that scenario for us?
So, the vulnerability does come from not having the number of space assets that are required, and that is why the private sector has a huge role to play in meeting that gap. Now, these kinds of vulnerabilities become more exposed, especially in times of conflict and times of need. So, when you have a conflict like Operation Sindur happening for 3 4 days, modern warfare does require continuous reconnaissance using satellites, and then you need like your very high resolution GPS data to be available as well. So in such scenarios, then you kind of become dependent on foreign providers for satellite data and satellite services, which now obviously it's not just a simple transaction anymore, right? Then it becomes embroiled in geopolitical considerations. So depending on which side of the fence you are on, as in the country is on, at any given point of time, you may or may not be able to get the kind of technology access that you require. Very interesting case in point is during Kargil war, right? It is alleged that the Western ecosystem, without naming which countries, who ran the high resolution GPS satellites at that point of time, they refused access to the kind of GPS data that we would require for doing mission planning and targeting the enemy outposts. And that was the reason that post Kargil war, Navik satellite family was thought of and given as a target for ISRO to achieve. So I think historically we have seen again and again that when you do not have technology and when you need it most, that is when people take advantage and leverage it against us. And the only way to hedge against us against this kind of scenario is to have your own indigenous infrastructure.
Interesting. And can you break down this infrastructure? Like what in the value chain, what are the different components like who are the component manufacturers? Are there software providers? Are there people who are launching these satellites? So who are some of these players, the big players who are there, or the big components of the sector? And where will you fit in that broader ecosystem?
Sure. I think as far as providers of subsystems and systems, there are many. I think that list, I think we will not be able to get to it. But let us talk about the overall value chain of space tech, right? So, firstly, let's start from the customer or consumer first. What does the consumer need? The consumer needs either data in terms of imagery, communication, broadcast, or PNT, which is GPS kind of pointing and navigation and tracking kind of technology. How do you get this data? You get this data from data sources, which are the satellites, right? The satellites in general consist of two parts: satellite bus and the payload. The payload is basically the piece of hardware in the satellite that does what the satellite is supposed to do. So if you have an imaging satellite, the payload would be an imaging payload. That could be a camera or a synthetic aperture radar, right? The satellite bus is the box around the payload, with electronics for navigation and for solar panels to collect the sun's energy, charge the batteries, which will power the payloads. Satellite bus plus payload together is the satellite. To launch satellites, you need rockets or launchers. And then, once satellites are in space, you want to continuously be able to control and monitor them, and also be able to communicate with them to downlink data frequently. That is where the ground segment comes into the picture. So, the ground segment basically consists of a ground station network across the world with associated data centers, because today we are looking at very, very data heavy operations. So these basically fall into launcher, ground station, and satellites. And then further from that, you have downstream the software part, where you have applications on top of the data that is provided by the satellite. So this is the overall value chain. If I have to give some examples, like in launches, you have the biggest company to do that in the world, which is SpaceX. Everyone knows about that. In terms of satellites, you have a bunch of companies, right from an ISI or a Synspective, which does SAR, to a Capella, to a Planet Labs or Maxar that does optical imaging, to Hawkeye, which does RF sensing, and so on and so forth. And then on the ground station segment, well, you have a big player like Amazon also getting into it, where they provide ground station as a service on their cloud. And another very famous company in that is Leaf Space. So again, I've taken just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the companies that are working on this across the world. Space is a vast, vast area to explore and to exploit, and it requires like thousands of companies across the world to do their parts.
Interesting. And within that, what is that big problem that you're solving? You, of course, spoke a little bit about the technology, but as you're saying, some part of it probably exists today. And of course, one has to keep evolving. But what happens if nobody's solving for what you're doing right now?
Okay, so the part that we are working on is Earth observation through synthetic aperture radar. So that falls within two buckets, both the satellite front, which is the source of data, as well as the geospatial or data product front, which is taking that data and building business or use case specific insights and intelligence out of it. And I wouldn't say that there aren't other people doing it. There are a lot of people across the world who are building SAR satellites. What we are focusing on, right? So if we look at all the SAR providers, private SAR providers in the world, all of them do SAR in a particular band called X band, which is roughly 9.6 gigahertz, give and take, right? Now in this kind of band, you get very high resolution imagery, and you can see in the dark and you can see through clouds. But the caveat here is you can't see through trees. Now if we look at tropical areas like India, Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, parts which have more than 50% of the world's population net. These are densely forested areas. Whether you want to find troop movement on the borders of Congo, or you want to find how much your land is stable in the foothills of the Himalayas, in the Deodar forests over there, or you want to do infrastructure monitoring in Al Sur in Bangalore, which is a densely vegetated area, you need the ability to see through trees, right? And that is the gap that we are trying to fill, which is with synthetic aperture radar at a lower frequency called L band, which is roughly at 1.25 gigahertz. Now within this band, there are no private players operating today, and
In India.
across the world.
Okay.
So in L-band, you have basically three major satellite families: SAOCOM from the
Mm.
Argentinian Space Agency, Allospalsar from the Japanese Space Agency, and NISR, which is a joint NASA-ISRO mission. Now, all of them, capture a large amount of area, but the trade-off is that the resolution is fairly poor, where you have 10-meter kind of resolution. Now, that is very good for doing very macroscopic work where you want to do climate change analysis, forest health analysis, analysis of polar ice caps, and so on and so forth. But if you want to do strategic and industrial use case, you need to improve the resolution, because that 10-meter resolution, where one pixel is equal to 10 meter on the surface, you can't even find a farmland in India. If you can't, find the boundaries of farmland, you can't even find roads and canals, right? So that is the technological gap that we have addressed. Within this segment, what we have achieved is 75 centimeter resolution, which is a more than 10x improvement on the standard. Now, what that means is now you have the ability to see through trees at a high resolution, where you can map out the roads in Alsur or MG Road, where you have very dense vegetation right from space itself.
Got it. So saying both from a national security and of course from an infra development point of view, this is the critical technology which of not only in India, I mean globally among the few players who are probably doing this. And tell me more broadly in India, given everything that's happening in space, how far or like ahead or behind are we in terms of what's happening? Like, where are we in terms of competing with the global players
So it
in
depends
general
who you.
across the ecosystem?
Sure, sure. So I would say India is one of the top 10 spacefaring countries in the world. That goes without saying, right? Like,
Hmm.
space tech is something that is not accessible to 90-95% of the countries out there. So in that sense, we are ahead of the curve at a global level. But personally, I believe when you're comparing, you want to compare with the best,
Hmm.
right? So if we compare ourselves with the USA or China, which are few miles ahead of us, both in terms of technology and also in terms of proliferation, I think there's a huge gap that needs to be met. Let me talk in terms of numbers, right? There are today roughly 12,000 satellites in low Earth orbit, of which 8,000 belong to SpaceX. 8,000 are Starlink satellites. So those are the numbers that we are talking about.
Hmm.
Whereas
Hmm.
India, with the government and the private ecosystem all together, we have, and all use cases, all types of satellites considered, we have today roughly 30 satellites, give or take.
Oh, wow.
So we have a long way to go.
Hmm. Got it. Interesting. So I think just given the stark difference that you're talking about, what is it that is missing today? Or I'm sure there are a lot of steps that are happening, but how do we unlock that 10x growth for us to start competing with some of these international players?
I think it's an all of the country approach, right? So
Hmm.
I mean, as a society, I don't think we are very similar to US, in the sense that we can't go toe to toe with US, where from day one you have $1 trillion company vision, and you there is enough investor pool as well as technical pool that will take up that kind of risk appetite and build a behemoth like SpaceX in 10 years, right? That I think is difficult for India. But India does have a lot of resources, both in terms of finances, as well as in terms of intellectual ability. Every country or every society has its own way of channeling the resources. I think India can follow more of the Israeli model, where you have like a bunch of different companies that specialize in different hardware, all working together as a unit for the nation under the umbrella of Israeli aerospace industries. I think now you don't need to form like a conglomerate of companies, but basically you have a bunch of companies, both old school big companies like your Adanis and your Reliance and your Tatas, as well as your new school space tech companies like ourselves, like Pixel, like Dhruva, like XD Links. uh, you need both category of companies, and also most importantly you need an ISRO, a DRDO, and your government to align, right? So personally I see where the value split can be is ISRO does your cutting edge research, which is building next gen tech. your space tech companies, your space tech startups work on this next gen tech and figure out how to make it smaller, cheaper, and do the production faster so that you can solve the problem of proliferation. And then your bigger companies, look at the more capex heavy problems and operational problems, like doing launches, running ground station networks across the world, running supermassive satellite constellations where you're looking at thousands of satellites, right? I think that is a very logical split that the industry can and should take, and maybe that is where the industry is heading in the next 5 to 7 years.
Interesting. I think it's a useful, framework to think about what the future could be. But tell me, just in terms of questioning the first assumption, right, which is ISRO should do the most cutting edge research. I mean, in some sense, you could argue that are we too dependent on ISRO as a result to do some of that work? And that could also end up being a bottleneck in that case, right? So, why not have a lot more research coming out of private companies in terms of cutting edge work?
I mean, see, ideally, your any tech company which calls itself a tech company should always be investing in R&D,
Hmm.
because as a tech company, it should be one of your duties to disrupt yourself, right?
Hmm.
Whether you take a Microsoft or an OpenAI or a Tesla or a SpaceX or an Intel, Qualcomm, whatever, right? They
Hmm.
are
Hmm.
not resting on the laurels of the one innovation that they made at the start of their journey, right? They
Hmm.
innovate every quarter, and that is
Yeah.
what any tech company should be doing.
Hmm.
Now, so that goes without saying. You're completely correct, right? The
Hmm.
private
Hmm.
industries have to invest in R&D. So I'll specify what I meant by ISRO doing more
Hmm. Hmm.
cutting edge research, where the R&D is in a segment where the monetizability or the profitability is not very clear yet,
Hmm.
right? Now
Hmm.
that is
Hmm.
something very few private companies, their shareholders will allow them to do R&D in, unless you have like a multi billionaire, close to trillionaire person like Elon Musk running the show, who's like, I don't care, I want to get to Mars, right, and solve everything, work backwards from there. That's an
Actually, this is
exception.
something, and I've been debating this with a few people. That is it. I mean, yes, of course, it's easy to blame that, shareholders, want immediate value, and that's the reason people are not doing it. Like the larger companies are not doing it. Or is it actually just a, case of risk aversion, right? Where because there are lower hanging fruits in terms of other areas of value creation, so someone getting into paints where there's enough capital, probably you might argue, or getting into cables where there's enough, players, one would argue. But just because there are some profit pools there, people are spending a lot of their energies over there. But something like space tech, for example, where yes, it would take time, but I mean, there are conglomerates who, frankly, should be doing the heavy lifting on that front, right?
Sure. I think, see, so what you're saying is not wrong, right? But I think risk is not binary. It's a spectrum. So on the lowest side of, low risk, you have stuff like, building cables and nuts and bolts and stuff where there's a market.
Hmm.
On the extreme higher side of the risk spectrum lies, can we send humans to one of the moons of Jupiter, for example, or
Hmm.
can we go and
Hmm.
capture an asteroid and mine it and stuff like that, right? So as I was saying, right, like, so risk lies in a spectrum. On the lowest hand and low risk side, you have your nuts and bolts kind of business where the business is well understood. On the highest, you have like absolutely exploratory stuff, like, I don't know, detecting gravitation waves or sending creatures or humans to some moon of Jupiter or Saturn or stuff like that. Building satellites, building rockets is comparatively still a high risk activity as compared to, let's say, building cables and nuts and bolts. And that kind of risk taking should be there in the industry, which is where I align with you. And that is, I think the Indian shareholders are also evolving, where they are getting the appetite for that kind of risk. That is why you have so many space tech companies getting funded. But when I say that ISRO has to do cutting edge work, it is to do with the highest of high risk R&D, where there is no guarantee of monetization, where there is a huge chance of failure, and the investment requirement is tremendous, and even the time frame that needs to be invested, that is also fairly large, and there is not even a guarantee that there will be success. But you have to do these kinds of endeavors to unlock new pieces of technology. Often, a war type scenario kind of forces societies to work on this with with all organizations, companies working towards this. But in peacetime scenarios, the incentivization is not that high for private companies to do at this kind of to do this kind of high risk work. But as a government research organization, it lies directly within the charter of an ISRO or a DRDO to work like this. So if we look at with very specific examples, right, like I think one of the primary missions, marquee missions of ISRO now in this decade, is sending humans to space. Now, the path to monetization and path to profitability of sending humans to space, it is not figured out, and it will take some time to figure out. But it is definitely a challenge worth solving. And that kind of challenge today, psychologically and from an investment requirement perspective, I think in India, ISRO is the only organization that is primed to solve those kinds of challenges.
And perhaps it is doing, I'm assuming what it can, and we'll talk about that. And of course, there's a, flurry of activity on the startup side, like yours and, the promising entrepreneurs. The other piece you talked about was, of course, the large conglomerates and then playing a, role, especially on the capex heavy side. Are you seeing activity where large conglomerates are also coming in some of these subspaces, ground
Yes.
stations and things like that?
Yes. So some of these bigger companies are working in their own way in the space industry. So they have their own philosophy on how to approach this. So for example, L&T does production of your PSLVs and GSLVs and SSLV and the rockets of ISRO. You have a Tata Advanced System investing in optical satellite technology. There are already, there's word in the market where some of the bigger players are looking into setting up ground station networks and satellite constellations. So these things are happening both in the background and in the foreground. Probably none of this makes the front page of the newspapers, but yeah, moves are happening in the industry.
Super. And of course, there's a lot of government activity in terms of PLIs, in terms of the IDEX program, in terms of the in-space initiative as well. Of
Yeah.
all of these, what has worked well thus far, and what do you think is still missing from the government's end?
So, I think all of the policies and the bodies created to enforce these policies, I think they have been done with very good intention. I think the primary policy change has been the new space policy, which has allowed private companies to do meaningful space activity. To enable that, in space is the body that uh, kind of authorizes and commissions space activity, but also acts as a glue organization that ties together bigger and smaller companies and aligns it with certain national missions that it proposes as different programs. And it also gives access to a lot of ISRO facilities to smaller companies, thereby saving the capex investment that would be required in setting up space tech labs. Uh, your IDEX and other similar schemes have been very, very useful, not just for space tech, but for defense tech in general, where younger and smaller companies have a way of doing a productized R&D in a very well formatted way, where you don't have to figure out how to navigate through government channels and can directly work on the development. And I think one of the beauties of IDEX project is that if you are selected and if you are able to deliver on the R&D deliverables that are required, then that company gets the minimum order quantity procurement contract for the scale up of that particular technology. So IDEX, I think, while it's a comparatively new program, it is a very fertile bed from where a lot of the future defense tech companies of India are going to come from.
Interesting. And if you were to double click on this one, and are there any what you would call as public good infrastructure, right? Like when you look at it, UPI, for example, when you think about the tech digital ecosystem, has really changed the landscape, right? Because payment suddenly becomes very easy and things like that. On the manufacturing side, probably let's say on the defense or more focus on the space tech side, are there any such public good infrastructures that you think could be created? That would be helpful to most folks.
So I think let's split space and defense over here, right? Like defense tech, most people are not going to use it, but
Hmm.
unless the nation has it, it's a huge risk, right? So with
Hmm.
it, defense is like having security guards for the entire nation. You feel their need when you need it the most, when someone attacks you, right? So goes without saying, you cannot compromise on defense tech at all, and any defense tech is for the public good. And Operation Sindoor happened this year, and we know how what the scenario was like at that point of time. With space tech, I think the uh, biggest public good, which will affect a lot of people in their day-to-day lives at a personal capacity, would be, I think, having navigation satellites of our own. So more Navik satellites which are able to give high resolution GPS data in India. So for example, the GPS data that we get from American, European satellites is not as good as what you would get in those countries, right? If you go to, for example, China and use Chinese Beidou satellites for GPS, the precision is crazy. On a multi-layered flyover, it will figure out which flyover you are on and which path, which lane you are on with very very high precision. Whereas the same phone, same GPS data, when you use in India, when you are going below a flyover, your map is going to throw you off by 100 meters to the left or right, right? So that is something that would be very very useful. And the other is, I think, a lot more weather prediction satellites, where today we have solved the low hanging fruit of at least minimizing loss of life during any sort of disaster, especially cyclones. But we should also be looking at, can we leverage weather monitoring to optimize our food security? Can we work on predicting your landslides that happen in Uttaranchal and Himachal every
Mm.
year now during monsoons? You know, with all these climate change activities, these things are affecting us on a regular basis, and that is where space tech has a role to solve some of these problems. And that is also one of the use cases that we think with our you know family of satellites and synthetic aperture radar. It's probably one of the best technologies for predicting landslides by monitoring your soil movement. So that is an impact that we are looking forward to giving to our nation and to the society at large the moment our satellite is launched.
Interesting. So one, when I think about what is stopping from it happening, right? One, of course, you would argue is probably more and more technologies, newer technology like yours, which we need to launch, these satellites. What else is the barrier today? Because I'm assuming there is enough funding in the government ecosystem to sort of make this happen, right?
So I think like the pieces are falling in place today. People have started their journeys towards it, but it is challenging both from a technological, business and fiscal perspective, so it will take time, right? We hear about SpaceX today, with what, 8,000 odd satellites and doing a launch every alternate day on a super heavy rocket. But SpaceX has been around for almost 20 years. If you remember the earlier stories around 2010s, when they were trying to figure out reusable rockets, people used to laugh at Elon Musk, that what are you doing, right? He had suffered multiple failures in the process. It took 15 years to stabilize the technology and then to capitalize on it and build a whole huge communication satellite constellation, and we are seeing that story today when all of that has stabilized. It takes time, right? It's been 3-4 years since your new space ecosystem has been given blessings of the government. It will take a little time. I think around 2030, give or take, is where we start seeing large scale impact of the work that is happening today in the background.
Interesting. And of course, the one barrier to that is going to be around the availability of capital. Now, let's say if I'm a growth stage investor, which I am, how do I de-risk myself with some of the inherent risks that are there in a business in this space?
So I think, see, if you're looking at risk and what could be the expected outcomes and expected value of those outcomes after a certain point of time, I think the lowest hanging fruit outcome that you would look for in a company is to get a decent acquisition, so that you make back your investment with a little bit of profit on top of that, right, to keep your LPs happy. Uh, so that is the what do you say, the floor expectation that you have from a company. Now, acquisition in this kind of segment is going to happen at a decent value if the company has its own IP. If the company is IP driven, then a lot of the valuation in its earlier days can actually be solidly backed by the IP that it has developed. And let's say if the business is not figured out, or if things become challenging for that particular segment to scale in, the IP is always there. So I mean, one way of de-risking is to see if the company is actually building the intellectual property that it says it's working on, right? So rather than, let's say, buying from outside and building a software stack on top of that, which also adds value, but if the company is directly building the hardware stack required, or directly building the core algorithms and the core software infrastructure required for extracting value from that technology, then it's an IP driven company which at its baseline is going to get sold for its IP value. And that is one way of, I think, de-risking in any deep tech sector, not just space tech.
Got it. And what else? One is, of course, when there's an IP involved, someone could end up buying it and there'll be value on that front. What else should a growth investor, how can they, get comfort in this space?
I think do a lot of background fundamental research, right? Don't depend just on the principal on the other side, the founder, to explain the tech and the market, which they will always explain with a bit of a vested interest. You want to do your fundamental research. Look at the tech, look at the fundamentals, the math and science of the tech, look at the industry, look at the history and how that industry has scaled in let's say a western country like US, for example, right? So that those are good proxies to have to get an indication that how will companies work out today. So when you know that, leave aside SpaceX, when you know that there is a company like Rocket Labs which is making rockets and delivering launches as a service at a higher cost than SpaceX, but still doing decent business, seeing that parallel, then you could think that, and hey, an Agnikul and Sky route can also be a decent business with similar economics. All they need to solve today is make sure that their rockets are uh, built reliably and they can go to whatever orbit they're promising to go to.
Got it. And in that meanwhile, as a company transitions from an early stage to a growth stage, and probably some of these risks end up getting mitigated, right? In the early days, there will be some scarcity of capital, and I'm sure you've gone through that journey yourself as a founder. What worked for you that some of the early stage founders in this space can, learn from?
I would again like to give credit to Tapan sir, my father and co-founder here, because that experience of 4 decades is not just in technological, from a technological perspective, but the experience of actually doing innovation in a domain where others have not entered in. Right? That's like driving blind in the dark, right? So that kind of confidence only comes from experience. So I think that philosophy that he had set in the company from day one is, okay, funding आएगा जाएगा जो भी होगा, that is separate, right? That's a separate part of the company. We keep building, we keep focusing on technology. With whatever resources we have, we figure out. Whatever resource we have is a constraint. Sometimes those constraints are good because they kind of force you to work in a very frugal and fast manner, right? So I think our first year of operation 3 years ago, we kind of found it fairly hard to get institutional funding. Maybe explaining the idea, explaining the application, and all of that was difficult. And even I think the Indian VC ecosystem was also just starting to venture into this segment. But we had decent angel investors, so with their backing, we built the prototype technologies in the first year and a half. Basis that prototype technology, we won a bunch of IDEX challenges. We started getting traction in the government ecosystem, defense, and space research ecosystem. Now, once those things fell in place, right, then it became more amenable for institutional investors to come in, because now the story fits into the mold that they want to look at. So, uh, focusing on developing IP and focusing on developing the core thing that brings value to the company, which is the technology itself, that is our our moat. That is what we head back to at the end of the day. So that is something I think that any new startup in space tech or defense tech or deep tech should focus on. You build the tech, right? Eventually people will understand your value. Don't wait for capital to build the tech. Get the bare minimum capital you require and start building the tech.
Got it. Interesting. And in your case, like you're saying, you of course have your father who's very experienced and in this space along with you. How does it work when you go back home? You also have your wife in the company as well. So how do you separate boardroom from family room conversations?
I think I have been lucky in the sense that both in terms of my spouse and in terms of my parents, everyone is kind of a workaholic, and more everyone is a geek who loves talking and doing math and physics and stuff, right? So that way, it's like working in the company is like a passion project for everyone, and it actually makes our lives that much more meaningful and happier. And with time, we have also figured out how to compartmentalize, separate the professional and the personal. So I think we have learned that, and it suits our core nature of all the individuals involved over here. So it's not been a problem at all.
Oh, super. And you mentioned a lot about SpaceX in our conversation, and of course, it has to come up given the topic. Who do you think will be India's SpaceX?
I don't think, like, honest answer, I don't think a single entity is going to be from India is going to be India SpaceX, but the
Mm,
Indian ecosystem together
mm,
can put up a competition and a solid competition to SpaceX.
mm,
Because SpaceX is not just rockets or not just satellites, it's a full spectrum space company. It is NASA on drugs, right? It is way more, it is ahead of NASA in terms of some of the technologies
mm,
that it builds, right? So
mm,
that is, you're talking about the A1 player in space tech in the entire world, in the history of humanity today, right? So I don't
mm,
think a
mm.
single entity will be able to compete with it, but together I'm sure the ecosystem can give a good fight.
Interesting. And what's your boldest prediction around this, given all that we need to do? By 2030, you're mentioning probably the ecosystem will be far more evolved than what we're seeing right now. What do you think might happen by 2030? What will we see in the Indian space tech ecosystem?
I think I mean, boldest prediction will. Realistic prediction would be that you will see private launches happening from Indian rocket providers. You will see a bunch of Indian companies having more than one satellite in space, and starting to expand their satellite constellation. Uh, I think these are very very realistic, but I think the boldest prediction is going to be, I think, your telecom industry will kind of eventually have to figure out that it has to compete with Starlink. Like, and the only way to do that is to have thousands of satellites in space, like at the same count as Starlink. Because if you have a orbit based, so to say, what do you say, communication tower, so to say, in orbit, your terrestrial communication networks just cannot compete with that, right? Uh, so for that, it is necessary to put up that kind of a satellite infrastructure, and to do that you also need to be able to have the launch infrastructure, because the your competitor who runs Starlink also runs the, it gatekeeps access to space today. So I think that I see that the telecom industry will have to necessarily double down and in some way invest in space segment to protect their future.
Interesting. And I think we are seeing some signs of that with Bharti and others, entering that space. For you as a company, what's your own goal of like over the next 5 years? Where is Sisir Radar and what's it looking like?
All right. So for us, the goal, not just 5 years, let me put it, it's roughly 5 years. By 2030, our goal is to have a minimum of 12 SAR satellites in orbit, in well chosen orbits that give us around half a day revisit across all our borders, and 1 to 1.5 day revisit across the landmass of India, which will be a huge step from where we are today, where as a country we have access of 10 to 15 day revisit over India. So that is what we want to achieve, and that is what we are on course of achieving. To at least fulfill half the overall constellation of 24 satellites that we are looking to build by 2030.
Super. That seems like aggressive, but a much needed vision also for the
Yeah.
country to, have. So all the best to you for that,
Thank you so
Soumya.
much.
I think we've covered some ground. And this is such a topic that, of course, within each of these, we could have gone into a lot of detail. But I think for our discussion today, we'll keep it slightly broad for people to get a sense.
Sure.
And then possibly we'll do, another conversation in the future where we might deep dive into, one of these and sort of, take it from there. But I really appreciate you taking out time for doing this.
Thank you so much. Happy to talk to you, Sarvesh, as always, and it's been a pleasure. Some of the questions were really deep and made me think quite hard. But yeah, absolutely lovely talking to you, and I love talking about space, and I hope that your audience finds it interesting to delve into. And looking forward to next time that we have a conversation like this again.
Thank you. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.